the sample will still be enriched for protozoa swimming to the surface, even though they didn't get fed, because they get programmed. And so, the microbes can become programmed. The animal, it's very important to feed on a, very consistent basis for a lot of reasons, but even at the microbial level, it's important.
Welcome to this episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Gail Carpenter. I'm with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, where I'm the State Dairy Extension Specialist. And today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Wenner from The Ohio State University. Glad you could join us today. I'll go ahead and kick it off. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with dairy production and your dairy journey so far? So for those of you at home who are listening, Benjamin and I have been friends for a while, so I know a lot of the backstory, but I'll go ahead and let him tell you guys how he got where he is.
I was told to give the censored version.
Yeah.
So I
the Cliff Notes version, yeah.
I grew up in north central Ohio and was fortunate enough to get scholarships to go to Michigan State. I didn't really have a plan when I got there, except my academic advisor, Sheely, was my academic advisor for about a week when I showed up. And he asked me about career goals, and I talked to him a lot about research and science. And he says, "You don't want to be a veterinarian. You need to jump ship now." And so I did. And I didn't actually change any of my courses. So I took all the chemistries and whatever, which came out to be a good thing in the end, because I probably would have skipped those in a heartbeat. But I was in that intro dairy class, I think. That was the first class I ever took, 9 o'clock Monday morning with Dr. Weber Nielsen. And knew absolutely nothing about dairy or the dairy industry. I grew up on a small beef hobby farm, had about 100 rabbits. Not very many people know that about me. And I think it was by November, maybe, was it that year or the following year, when you guys were short one dairy challenge person, and she recommended me. So I was
I think it was sophomore year. Yeah.
And so I was just chilling in my dorm and got the phone call asking me what I was doing. And of course my answer was nothing. And so I was told to meet you at the pavilion, hop in the van, one of the two of those, and the thing we do.
Yeah.
I was getting briefed on my role on the dairy challenge team, which was write everything you hear and take a lot of pictures. And so with absolutely no skill set beyond that, and I knew how to use PowerPoint, I think we made that really nice PowerPoint image. I still have the rolling conveyor belt where the person, I think, becomes decapitated due to the ocean. I can't even.
Not something we recommend for Dairy Challenge now.
I can't believe to this day that we won that, because then I went on that study abroad and I didn't find out that we won until I got back, I think, in the spring.
And that was the local Dairy Challenge. That was like our Michigan State.
The novice version. Yeah.
Right.
But it did kind of prompt me to take some more dairy classes and really nutrition classes at that point. And it was when I got back that I was able to work for Marcus, which I'm pretty sure I can blame you for setting me up with that too, Marcus Holman's research project.
Oh, really? I thought it was the other way around.
I'm not sure. And then I took the class with Beatty, the ruminant nutrition, and finally I think found something that I actually loved doing. And I'd been balancing diets for animals in high school, the animals back at home, but I guess it never occurred to me that was a career or a whole field that careers evolved out of. I did my master's in animal well-being and swine management. It's kind of difficult, I guess, to put a finger on it, because I took a little bit of a deviation where I enjoyed arguing about the ethics behind raising animals. I've got a bunch of books on the shelf about that stuff, and really tried to focus on studying the great minds that lead that debate, because I think it's really important that we're educated in how we communicate with the consumer, but also how we debate the integrity, the ethics, the morality of raising animals for food. But I missed nutrition really badly, so I walked into Firkin's office one day and just asked him if he would ever take a PhD student. He kind of laughed And he gave me, I don't know, 10 papers to read and asked me to come back. And I didn't realize that that's his informal interview process where he just quizzes you on every single paper you read to see if A, you read it, and B, you can, I wouldn't say keep up, but maybe hold par.
Yeah.
And so then that's where he asked me, he said, I need somebody who can fix things, and I've got these fermenters in the basement. So he showed me the fermenters, and I've become, you can disagree with me, but I've become, I guess, one of the people that everyone calls with fermenter questions. I hesitate to use the word expert, but that was not on my bingo card. I don't know when that happened or how that happened, but we figured out how to make them work. And I guess I just really like trying to figure out why things don't work the way they're supposed to. Somebody got into a bunch of rubbing alcohol behind me. Suddenly smelled it. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of evolved into its own living form. We've rebuilt those fermenters, sold 60 of them, I think, at this point, to labs all across the U.S. and into Europe and Canada. And now I teach. So I went and did tech service and then got the chance to come back and teach. And actually my role is teaching in extension. So it's an interesting transition to try to take really complicated research and then try to dial it back to apply. What did you see on farms while you were doing field nutrition or technical service work? What did you see in the labs, and how can you relate that back to a sophomore and junior level nutrition course and kind of lay the groundwork? And then I do undergrad research too, so I try to mentor students in undergrad research. So a long, windy path, but I've never owned a dairy cow. I'm not sure that I ever will. I have never worked a parlor shift, although I wish I had. And I do love the industry because I think they're really wholesome people who juggle so many different hats. It's a really fascinating business, and I really enjoy studying the whole business aspect of it. Not just the nutrition, but all the pieces and parts that play into it. So started because of you. It's all your fault.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, everybody.
Otherwise, I might still be sitting on a couch somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, I doubt that. Might still be arguing about hogs somewhere. But so let's talk about fermenters a little bit. So I actually kind of stumbled on fermenters too. When I was looking at master's programs, like a lot of undergrads, I didn't really know what grad school was like, or really what to look for in an advisor or anything. But I was intrigued by the program at the University of Minnesota and ended up working with Dr. Marshall Stern, who also happened to have fermenters. And I was just kind of generally nutrition interested. I took a lot of the same classes you did. And I don't know, nutrition is just really fascinating to me. I think it's something that we have a lot still to figure out. And it's just so important for how things go on farm. And it's so interrelated with management. And it's just from a practical standpoint, but also from a scientific standpoint, nutrition's just an awesome field.
I liken it to
but I didn't know what I was looking for.
I liken it to a puzzle, right? So I tell my students, nutrition's like a puzzle, but there's 10 to 12 different solutions. And you have to figure out which one is going to work in a unique situation.
Yes. Which one or ones. Sometimes it's, yeah. There's not always a right answer, which people have a hard time wrapping their heads around sometimes. Not just undergrads, but people in industry even sometimes too.
But I think it's funny because I got into arguing animal ethics for the same reason. And so really all I was looking for was puzzles that didn't have a single correct answer.
Well, you found it, and this is going to keep you busy for a while.
Yeah, probably.
But yeah, so I kind of ended up in the fermenter world on accident too. Like I was looking for ruminant nutrition, dairy nutrition, and kind of fell into the position with Marshall there at University of Minnesota, and he had 8 fermenters in the basement of Hacker Hall there. And I grew to appreciate them quite a bit over the couple years that I was working with Marshall, and you now are one of the people that I call when I have fermenter questions. And I know we've spent a bit of time talking about them, but I think maybe for the folks that are listening might not know what the heck we're talking about. So can you kind of just describe what a fermenter is, maybe even get into a little dual flow, what the value of dual flow is. Can you give us just a bird's eye view of some of those in vitro techniques?
Yeah, I can do that. And I would tell you that I think we went through this renaissance in fermenters recently where a lot of people suddenly had interest in using them. And so if you're an industry person, you're starting to see a lot of pop-up of their use and citation and data. And so it might be raising a lot of questions. But I would tell you we're probably going to hit a slow point as far as new labs building them, because a lot of the minds that were behind the engineering for making the new sets that we sold have kind of retired. So we might have plateaued here for a while. We got to start black market dealing out of closets again. But essentially what you have is you've got a clear jar. I mean, it doesn't have to be clear, but it's nice if it is, because you can see what's going on. Otherwise, it's pretty messy. And you got a glass jar, ideally, so that there's no absorption. And so what we can do is run a contained fermentation and simulate rumen activity. We wouldn't call it necessarily in vitro because, I mean, I guess it's an in vitro technique, but we're sustaining that over really long periods of time. Some of the data is up to 3 weeks, which is actually longer than some of the crossover studies in tie stall cows. So, I think to just classify it as in vitro and walk away discredits the fact that it's probably superior in many ways to the data you're going to generate from batch cultures, for example. And so we've got this jar, we're pumping in buffer, and the buffer is calculated based on cow performance and what they might generate in their saliva. And we're also trying to keep an eye on the pH of those units. And then we've got an outflow tube. So a single flow, as you're talking about, basically maybe a certain number of milliliters or ounces comes in every hour and a certain amount passes out down the tube, and we're just constantly diluting the solids. And the dual flow then is where we run a filter. And so we can actually, just like a rumen, where the liquid passes out of the rumen quicker than the solids, we can simulate this by filtering some solids and just pushing out a liquid mixture. It's still brown and gross, but we put like a metallic or a cloth filter on there. And so maybe we can do a 10 to 15% per hour dilution of liquids and a much lower dilution of solids, sort of like how the reticulum will retain some of those solids for a while. Really nice tool, I think, more or less evolved in the 60s and 70s, and there's a lot of literature. And at that time, they were trying to maintain consistent pHs. At that time, they were maintaining consistent pHs. Sorry, I've got a lot of construction occurring over here. And so they were locking in the pH with acid and base buffer pumps. So I think that was that's a good start. But what you'll see now in the literature in the last 10, 15 years is that we've really cut those loose. So we figured out how to design buffers a little bit more effectively. And we've realized that when you maintain a set pH, that's not really simulating the rumen environment, because the rumen environment wants to flux in response to nutrients. And so one of the things that we were really pushing when I started my PhD was trying to remove those pumps because they're really problematic, but also generate then higher quality data where we get true naders and pH and the recovery. And otherwise, everything else that's really changed in the past 15, 20 years has just been ways to make them more economical, ways to make them mix better. There's a lot of debate about, maybe not a lot, but within the fermenter people, debate about whether or not they should be spinning much faster or much slower, because we'd say that the protozoa, which are pretty big, would get confused, and chemically they're tracking chemical signals of where to swim and hide out and not pass out, so confused and kind of deviate away from their slow spots if you spin it too fast. And then of course Firkins had that student Sanjay Karnati who has the publications where he designed the protozoa retention filters, which made a big difference for us, because I'm not going to tell you that there's a lot of protozoa in the fermenters, but having protozoa in the fermenters maintains some of the genetic diversity as well. And also, if we're doing methane work, protozoa do have a pretty pivotal role in methane production. And so those filters enable us to retain the majority of the protozoa in the fermenters. And I've recently updated those again, and we've got the numbers back up to like 30,000 cells per mil. So, a million in the rumen versus 30,000 cells per mil in the fermenter. But you have to remember that those fermenters get fed a much lower feeding rate density for the amount of volume that's in there. And so I just don't think that the fermenter sustains enough organic matter for the protozoa to be much higher in concentration. So what's really nice about the fermenter is it enables us to just apply any treatment we want. Anything can die. And we just restart, right? We're not killing a cow, making a cow sick. I don't have to worry about a bunch of protocols and whatnot. But it's an adapted culture. So whereas a batch culture, if I hit it with something in the batch culture and I look at a 6-hour or 12-hour effect or even a 24-hour effect, it's a more dramatic effect in batch culture because those microbes weren't exposed ahead of time and given time to adapt. Kind of like we see Meninsen, where the rumen microbiome will adapt to Meninsen over time. And you can see the same thing where treatments that looked really extreme and successful in batch culture are not nearly as effective in continuous culture. And since I do a decent bit of conversation, if not research, in methane mitigation strategies, then of course we can see really extremely successful methane mitigation strategies in batch culture that don't necessarily hold their weight in continuous culture.
Yeah. Right.
And of course we can.
And then even less in
yeah,
vivo.
And then VFA production is another really challenging thing because if you try to measure VFA production in the rumen, there's continuous absorption, and that absorption is modulated by pH and by concentration of VFA. So it's very difficult to cost effectively estimate VFA production in a rumen. Whereas in the fermenter, because there's no absorption, we can get a true VFA production, a net production. And we actually just Hannigan's group came up and did a study with us years ago, 2013, but we just published it in JDS, where we quantified the net conversion of VFA in the fermenter because we were able to put in an isotope and recapture the majority of it there, even in gas. So it makes for a really nice tool, cost effective.
So it might sound, to people who aren't familiar with fermenters and kind of listening, very technical and not necessarily something that impacts how we feed cows. Do you have any examples of studies that you have done or others have done that has directly impacted how we feed cows and how we understand nutrition on farm?
Yeah, that's a good question. So probably in my own studies, less of those. Although we did do a couple studies, I haven't published them, but we abstracted them at ADSA that were kind of instructive. So there was that long conversation about palmitic fatty acids and the palm fats and how they increase fiber digestibility, right? So everybody says, well, that has to be a relic of the analysis. You run a fecal digestibility and there must be an error somewhere. You go back through and you keep checking. You can't figure out what the errors are. The ether extract NDF seems to come out just fine. Well, when we ran those in fermenters and we do a dose response in fermenters, we applied 1, 2, and 3% palm fat in there. We're able to show the same quadratic response in NDF digestibility that you had in the cow. But the difference was then, so in that case, we had a mystery in a cow that we wanted to go backwards on. We can take those samples, we can look at the VFA production, we can look at the fiber degradation, but we could also take those samples and look at the microbial population and how it changes. And some of the data that I've got to get out this fall, maybe Thanksgiving break, we'll see, is then we have narrowed down 2 or 3 genera from the fermenter that responded in population quadratically to match the degradation in NDF. Yeah, right. So then here's probably your culprits. So that's a great example of how we know something on the farm, but we're trying to explain how that actually works. Because if I go out to the farm and I just say, well, put some more fat in, it's going to increase NDF digestibility, you're going to look at me like I'm nuts, because this book here will tell you that fat decreases in fiber digestibility, right? So the other one recently, something that...
And for those listening and not looking, that book was...
Oh, the ruminant, the basic ruminant textbook by Church. I think this is the one that Beatty made me buy, actually.
I got that one behind me too. The ruminant animal, digestive physiology and nutrition.
From the MSU SBS, $67.95. I bet you can't buy for that now. But the other thing that we did recently, something that's really bothered me is this conversation in the Cornell model about whether or not there's a role, an actual value to peptides, right? So the model can tell you that there's peptides. And in my head, it would say, well, if microbes could pull up some amino acids or incorporate some peptides, they could kind of save themselves some energy from building all that up from ammonia. And so why do we say that there's no value to the peptide concentration, or that peptides are always in excess and there's no peptide response? And so what we tried to do in fermenters is do a dose response to peptides versus urea. And we were able to show that as you add in urea or peptides, as you add in crude protein, we did get a fiber digestibility response, microbial growth, right? But this is one of those things that's kind of disappointing to the person who was hoping to see something different. But my urea and my peptides, there was actually no difference. So in those studies, essentially what it was telling me was, yeah, if you put more urea in the rumen, you'll get more microbial protein, you'll get more fiber digestibility. But if you put peptides in, there's no additional value to that. So what's my logical response? I'm a little low on crude protein. I want to boost my digestibility. I dump in some urea because it's cost effective. Not what I was hoping to see, because I was hoping to say, well, the model does have a value to the peptides, but at least from that study, it would not appear so. So that's maybe how you take something in a fermenter and apply it to the on-farm nutritionist, maybe not to the producer. To the producer, I guess more than anything, I would look at it and say, this is the way that we can roll out products and get verification on products as timely as possible and as cost effectively as possible, because whatever R&D budget it takes to generate a product, that's all getting passed on to you afterwards. So this is a tool to speed things up. And those people who have labs with these are looking at really long wait times right now to run these. I've heard of wait times well over a year just to get a feed stuff or a feed additive on the list, on the docket to get moved through, because there's a lot of interest in using these tools, because in 2 months you can figure out the answer to something for 20% the cost it might take to do it in cows. And we have pretty good confidence in that. Microbial population is pretty representative, and the data is pretty repeatable. It's the palm fat was probably the most fun when we got that quadratic response and digestibility. I looked at that and thought, no, that can't be it. It was cool. And then now there's this big push for sustainability. So we can use this as a really clean way to measure methane production, and not just methane production, but what are the consequences of decreasing methane production? Because I think people get lost and they think, oh, well, I decreased methane production, this is the new magical additive. But you have to think about, how did decreasing that methane influence VFA? How did it influence digestibility? And if the producer incorporates it tomorrow, are they going to see a dip in production? And so we have the opportunity to kind of model in these jars a lot of options before we ever roll them out to cows, because it's very difficult to measure methane production in cows on farms. And even harder to measure not just methane, but also energy status and protein status. So if you can get a cow to breathe in a chamber and those green feed hoods and tell you that it decreased methane, that still doesn't mean that the animal was more efficient. That's a big challenge that faces us, and I know the Netherlands is looking at jumping headlong into that regulation maybe before we have all the answers.
Right. Well, and to your point about the value of these here, to run the cow trials that you would have needed to run to get the same data that you got on that palm fat study, for example, it would have been incredibly cost prohibitive to most labs. I mean, you don't have a huge research budget yourself, right? But you're able to get that accomplished without having to apply for a big grant or get some company money or anything like that. And also, I mean, you talk about animal ethics and trying to reduce our animal usage for research, the 3 R's of the IACUC, right? yeah, we're able to just get such fast turnaround on some of these basic questions that would be so expensive and so difficult and require a lot of manpower to be able to get out of a cow study.
Yeah, and increasingly, running animal research is going to be a privilege, not a right. And so we need to utilize that privilege as effectively as possible, as judiciously as possible, so that we can maintain the trust of the public for us to do animal research. Because I don't think all fields are going to maintain that public trust. And we need to make sure in agriculture that we do.
Yeah, for sure. I want to back up to what you were talking about a little bit ago, though. Protozoa. When I was doing fermenter stuff, when I first started my master's, we were just, protozoa don't live in fermenters, but it's no big deal because it's just protozoa. And I think maybe you're a little bit triggered by that, I would guess. So why? Can you explain what is it that washes the protozoa out of those fermenters when we run them classically? You don't have to get too into the technical details on that. But where do the protozoa go, and why do we care? Are protozoa actually important? Because I don't know. I heard that they don't actually do that much.
Yeah, see, you are trying to trigger me. We should just get Perkins on here at the same time. But I have mixed feelings about whether or not we really need them, but I'll talk about the dilution piece first. So protozoa, traditionally, they sense when an animal is fed. They swim up to the surface, they eat, and then they swim away, and they try to swim away from the outflow. So protozoa don't turn over like bacteria on an hourly or daily basis. They would require at least maybe a couple days to turn over and replicate. And so because of that, they need to sustain themselves by hiding, because the turnover rate of the rumen is much more rapid than 2 days. And so in the fermenter, that becomes a little challenging because there's not really any place for them to hide. And so it's difficult to maintain them without specialized filters. So basically what the filter would allow you to do is increase your fluid dilution rate to be more replicable to animals, while at the same time decreasing your solid dilution rate. And by solids, I mean things smaller than protozoa, so that the protozoa don't get sucked up through the liquid in the filter. So you kind of slow down the growth pressure on them so that they have time to grow and replicate. There's a lot of fermenters run the world around where the protozoa are washed out. And the truth of the matter is, probably in fermenter research, I don't see the effect of protozoa being there or not being there directly. So I don't see the effect of them being removed directly. And in my dissertation, and we have that paper where we did the defaunination. So we ran fermenters, and we ran fermenters where we removed the protozoa. And we thought, oh, well, protozoa contributes making methane. That's one of their big notorious things, because methanogens live on the outside of them, kind of like fish on the outside of a whale shark, And yeah, and so they attach, and you can actually see them glow, and they suck the hydrogen.
Symbiotic relationship within a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so then they release methane right off the sides of the protozoa. But then in my dissertation work, we removed them, and we didn't see an effect of decreased methane production, because in my opinion, the methanogens just found another place. They embedded within more of the biofilm. They got access to the hydrogen being made by the fiber degraders in the biofilm, and therefore they just continue to make methane. They're really good at that. The protozoa were gone, but there was no effect. And there was no effect on some of the protein degradation for the same reason, because protozoa also have a reputation for breaking down bacteria and causing some futile cycling of nitrogen, where bacteria are growing and then they're killed off by protozoa and broken down, and they have to grow all over again. There's wasted energy and nitrogen there. But we didn't see that either, because I think, again, if you remove protozoa from the equation, the microbiome will adapt to accomplish the same things that frustrated you before. And so instead, I think it's more about, how do you use the protozoa that naturally want to re-inoculate? So if you nuke them all out of the rumen of a cow, I could give you 2 or 3 weeks, she's going to have them again. So instead of trying to continuously remove them or create this vaccination like some people were working on to kill them off, we should just focus on how we manage them. And I thought that some of the recent work out of Cornell did a really great job of quantifying the amino acid contribution of protozoa. And it would appear that protozoa help enrich for some of those branch chain and especially lysine amino acids that we know are really important in animal nutrition. And you'll see that they have a higher concentration in their I guess, cells, dead cells that we analyze than the bacteria do. And there's also some interesting observation where the fatty acid composition of protozoa is different than bacteria as well. And that's probably the next evolving story. It's not just amino acids, but bacteria and protozoa have alternating proportions of 16O and 18O related to membrane fluidity, which kind of makes sense because those big protozoa have to swim around. And you can pull that from the old books, like the Hobson and Stewart book. It's got that in the tables, but we just didn't talk about it 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Anyway, so are they bad? Are they good? I'm not 100% sure, but what I do know is that they're there. And the best way that we can manage them is to try to promote situations where there's not this rapid influx of nutrients that they're going to go nuts on. So one of the things about these high sugar diets, I think that concerns me a little bit is you can see when protozoa get put in a high sugar diet, they kind of wig out. They swim around like crazy. They consume as much as they can. And I think there's probably what Tim Hackman would have said. He's out of Davis. He would talk about energy wasting, right, or energy spilling. So bacteria energy spill, protozoa probably energy spill as well, because their only goal, they don't care about the community's energy efficiency. They just care about, well, if I can consume it all and burn it, it's better than my competitor being able to consume some of it. And so there's a lot of energy wasting that occurs if that, especially rapid available carbohydrate is not paired with something for them to grow on. So you manage that by balancing your nitrogen and energy. It's more than just worrying about nitrogen excretion in the environment. It's, if you want the animal to be most efficient, then you need to pair your carbohydrate and your protein pools. And I think that is where the Cornell model has been particularly useful for nutritionists, pairing those pools. But then, protozoa also are really important for helping stabilize pH. So the other reason you do want to keep them around, even though they make methane and break down protein and whatnot, they are really useful for consuming copious amounts of starch at once and preventing that from being fermented really quick and causing that sharp decline in pH. And so you can see where they do serve some purpose in those higher starch diets, especially in your like high ground corn diets where you have a lot of starch potential there in a short amount of time, and they'll help manage that. Now, what I always tell the 4-Hers, right, because then I also work with kids, is protozoa are the best example for me of why feeding consistency is really important, because they become programmed and they know if you did 2 weeks of feeding them at the same exact time, and then the one day you just don't feed them and you go and pull the sample will still be enriched for protozoa swimming to the surface, even though they didn't get fed because they get programmed. And so, the microbes can become programmed. The animal, it's very important to feed on a, very consistent basis for a lot of reasons, but even at the microbial level, it's important.
I don't know what your perspective is. It seems to me that, so Marshall, my master's advisor, he did a lot of protozoal work like in his early career and loved talking about protozoa. But it felt like, there was 30, 40 years ago, there was a pretty strong interest, and then that kind of backed off, and we started thinking that maybe they weren't as, important or as impactful, I guess I could say. But it seems to be there's more of a resurgence in this lately. The Cornell model has been updated and is including more protozoal modeling. You're doing a lot of research in this area. You and Jeff are doing a lot of research in this area. So are protozoa making a comeback?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I would say no, based on the fact that I have what I would consider to be a pretty good paper, but I think it's only been cited 7 times. Oh.
There you go. Yeah.
might end up being one of my better papers. And I would say they're really high quality citations, but there's not a lot of people reading that. But it did really bring to light the fact that I think over years we've misestimated and we continuously misquote the 50% microbial biomass, being protozoa. I think the work out of Cornell also echoed that, protozoa are not 50% of the microbial protein like we suspected. It's actually a much smaller quantity. So it's interesting that they continue to get, I do think if you look at the abstracts, you talk to people, they're getting more attention, even though we're all arguing that they have less of a percentage within, representation within the rumen. But I think it's because of the diversity of what they can do, the diversity within that, that class of microbes. I think the other thing that we're not paying a lot of attention to, and we should be, is the fungi. And so as we can improve our 18S sequencing, if we can really get to where we can sequence the protozoa and sequence the fungi, and we can better describe their role in the rumen, there's a good chance there's a lot going on with the fungi that we haven't really identified or paid attention to either. And so I think some of it's just technology. So as technology revolves back around and there's opportunity, we had Tonsil Park, Dr. Park, who's now back in Korea, who he was able to hand pick cells and isolate them and then sequence their genome, protozoa cells. And we had, there was a couple students, I think, in Europe that were differentially filtering protozoa by size, keeping them alive and looking at their methanogenic and proteolytic activity by size and describing them by genera. And so some of the attention grows for those areas when the technology becomes available to do the work again. So, but as a whole, I'm not sure that many people are doing, because I really do think I've only got 7 citations in 5 years. So, and 2 of those are mine.
Write that paper for Benjamin. Do your part for protozoa work. So what's next on the research horizon for you or Jeff in that lab there? What's something coming up that you're excited about that you want to share?
I think we're kind of running a couple different directions. So Perkins and his students have really started focusing on those branched chain VFA, branched chain amino acids, and those stories have gotten a lot of notice at conferences, and that's really cool. On my end, we're wrapping up an organic feed additive study where we fed an essential oil product to mitigate methane. It actually worked, which surprised me because I didn't go in thinking that it would. My apologies if the sponsors would listen to this, but it really did work, and it worked in a way that was significant, right? And like 11% decrease, and it matched previous data that had been observed in some other batch work, and so we're actually trying to then extract the microbial, DNA and try to explain, okay, as we dose in this essential oil and we got this response, what was it that changed among that microbial population? So maybe you can get start trying to drive at a mode of action. That's really, it's not enough to just say I have this product and it does something. You have to actually be able to describe what it does. I'm a salesman on a farm anymore. I have to know how something works. I can't just tell you it does. You're not going to take my word for it. And so try to help describe how it is that it worked. And then, as I'd hinted before, I think we always have this tendency to say things are true, but we don't necessarily. We just inherited that from someone. And so I think we're going to try to circle to some of the mycotoxin work and the role of protozoa with mycotoxins. That's really easy work for us to do. We have all the methods, and we have the people who know, undergrad students who are really talented and know how to do that work. So that's going to be some fun stuff that I think we'll be able to roll that into Tri-State, if not Ottawa. Of course, there's a much more lenient deadline for Tri-State than there is for ADSA. And I'm also doing actually a little bit of welfare work, undergrad research and welfare work, and probably circle back around to the importance of water cleanliness, because we got 6 nutrient classes, but how often are we talking about the importance of water unless everything else goes wrong? If you're a nutritionist on a farm, you never talk about water unless you couldn't fix it any other way.
Okay, so I'm I'm gonna push back on you on that because every time you ever hear a water lecture, and maybe it's just because we both had BD, right? But
It could be.
every time you have somebody is giving like the 6 classes of nutrients and they talk about water and they always say water's the one that everyone forgets about. But everybody says that. But it's true though, until you see like until you're on farm and you're seeing issues and you're seeing like a lot of dirty waters or whatever else, like it is one thing that we all just like know, but don't always like take it with us when we're going and doing on farm stuff.
Well, we had this really cool data, so you're stuck with the water you have on the farm, right? I realize there's technologies and whatever, but you're kind of stuck with what you have on the farm. We had that really cool data that we finally abstracted at ADSA this year where the sheep, because sheep are a nice tool to use for things like this. And so the sheep were given 3 waters and we cleaned them at different frequencies. But after a week, you go to clean that bucket that hasn't been cleaned all week, scrub it out, brand new, everything. The sheep still don't touch that water because they go, oh, that's been dirty. I'm not going back over there. And I think the same thing happens with our cows. If you don't habitually clean the dirty waters, then your cows eventually just drink less water. And eventually that could be a limitation for your cow performance. It doesn't matter if you clean them once a month and you do the very best. I'd rather you just dump them out and hit them with a brush than bleach them once a month. And I think that can make a pretty big difference in water intake. But of course, a lot of people aren't quantifying water intake either. How many people are sitting on a meter tracking that?
Yeah. Well, it's it actually, as you're talking, it's making me think. In our close-up pen at our dairy here, we have 2 waterers, and one of them the cows never use, and it's always dirty. And we're always saying, oh, you got to clean that waterer. And I was, when I was the manager, I was always saying, I got to clean that water, and then I didn't. So it's not anybody's fault, but it was kind of the circular. Well, yeah, that water needs to get clean, but none of the cows ever use it. But do the cows never use it because it's never clean? Like, do they just know that it's not? And that's in a close-up pen too, kind of a high-risk group.
And that's a learned behavior. So I don't think that, and we didn't do this for longevity, but I don't think that you can snap them out of that, right? Cows learn bad behaviors early. And that's what they learn how to sort when they're really young, right? We've seen that data. We got the jerseys at Waterman to eat rocks, and I'm pretty sure they learned that at a young age. Right? Cows learn bad behaviors early, and I don't think you can get them to snap out of it just because you have a good day where nobody called and blew your phone up and you finally clean the water, right? And that.
I think it's going to be really interesting too as we see more group housing in calves and how that impacts. Emily Miller Cushion down in Florida is doing some cool work on learned behaviors in calves. And so, like, if you're group housing versus individual housing calves, are they going to pick up bad behaviors from each other? Like, is it going to be they learn good behaviors from each other? It's going to be, do they learn different behaviors if they're housed? And she actually just came out with a paper on that recently. They learn different behaviors versus in individual housing versus group housing. And I don't know, there's just so many things that just all kind of tie together, and we all kind of, in research, we get in our little bubbles, right? This is the thing that I'm really excited about, and kind of forget there's so many other things going around because the farm is a system. And I know you and I have talked about that a lot, that the farm is a system and we have to think of it as a whole.
Yeah, that's, I guess, always my goal is to try to think out, pop that bubble, I guess, right? Think outside that zone, because there's a lot of stuff that we miss if we don't challenge ourselves. That's what's so fun about teaching all these undergrads that didn't grow up on farms, is they are very quick to pop that bubble and challenge the norm, what we expect and what we see. And they ask a lot of really interesting, challenging questions.
I definitely agree. That's one of my goals, and not to get off on a completely different subject, but when I'm teaching, I'll usually have a mixed group of people from farms and not from farms. And one of my goals is always to make that psychological safety so that the students who didn't come from a farm feel okay asking questions and not like they're going to ask a stupid question, because I think a lot of times, they're going to come up with something that we've never thought of, but that, we've been thinking the same way about some things for however many decades now, right? And so, yeah, I think, but I think too that the industry can kind of value from that approach, because these students, they're talented, they're good, they're learning quick, and they're going to have jobs out in the industry. Like you said it, you didn't grow up on a dairy farm, but you've impacted a lot of cows through your work in industry and through your work in academia.
Hopefully for the better.
So, yeah, I think so. I haven't interviewed any of those cows, but I don't know. So hopefully that's something that the industry kind of can adapt to as well. Like there's going to be a lot of valuable personnel out in industry who see things very differently, and it's important that we view that as a strength.
Yeah, we have to. We really don't have another option, to be frankly honest, because the labor market is going to be
That's
so
exactly
tight.
Right. Yeah.
But I think the companies that are really forward thinking and grab those students and put them on their payrolls early that are really challenging will be the companies that are looking in 30 years backwards and feel pretty good about it. But I think we're at a pretty pivotal time in the workplace. Now's the time to grab some of those people who think very differently than maybe we were trained to think.
Well, I mean, that's just math, right? There's fewer farms, and because there's more jobs in the dairy industry than there were. But if we want to fill the greater jobs, there's going to be fewer kids coming from farms just because there are fewer farms in general. So there's fewer farm families. And so I think that, just mathematically, you have to, I say accept the students who don't come from farm backgrounds, but I think even maybe move a step ahead and view that as an asset to us as an industry, right? Like they come in with a different perspective. They're keen, they're excited, they're coming in with fresh eyes. And I think it serves us to view that as a positive and not as something we have to manage around. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's my soapbox.
Well, we all need one. I've got a few. We didn't even get that deep into some of mine.
I know. Well, I had to text Lydia and let her know that I was going to be late for a meeting, but that it was your fault, and she said it was okay because you have made her late for several things as well. So.
Oh man, you should ask her about the time I made her like an hour late to feed the cows.
Boy,
it was not a good day.
I'll ask her about it.
I think it was the day we were talking about whether or not she was going to be your student. It was a long conversation.
Wow. Well, we've been happy to have her here, so she's been doing well. Okay. I was going to ask you this question because I know you love this question, and I know we're short on time, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's something you believe very strongly that you don't think a lot of other people agree with you on?
Well, I still am going to be really stubborn about those peptides and amino acids, to be honest. I know we failed in the project, and I think maybe some of that was just the implementation, the way that we implemented the treatments. But I just don't see a way that you can provide amino acids to microbes. And we know that we give methionine and we get a better fiber digestibility, right? We know that if we feed some rumen available methionine, that kind of helps with fiber and offsets some of the milk fat depression issues, right? So surely if microbes are provided some high quality RDP, there has to be a benefit in the rumen, in ruminant nutrition, to high quality RDP sources rather than just dumping urea into everything. And I do believe that very strongly, and I do know I'm in the minority. And I do realize that we have to find a way to make it pencil. But we'll find the data. I do believe that one to be true. So, and I have a lot of opinions about lab and in vitro digestibilities and which ones are better or worse, and I guess which ones are useful for you. But maybe we'll have to save that for a different day.
All models are, how does that go about all models are
wrong.
Bad. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Shoot, I was trying to figure out, I don't remember who said that, but we all like to repeat it, and then we don't like to remember it when we go to feed animals by model.
Yeah. That's
kind of depressing to think that by the time you've finished your statistical analysis, that what you've drawn up to explain your data is wrong in some way.
Yep. Well, that's what keeps us in business, right? If we knew all the answers, then we could all retire.
Yeah. Yep. I probably plan to retire before we find the answers.
Yeah. Or society will collapse. Who knows?
Well, I was betting on meteors, but after last week, I'm not sure that one's in play anymore.
We got that figured out. Yeah.
I was kind of scratching my head. We talk about environmental sustainability, right? And everybody's really worried. But we were all sitting there, drinking coffee, watching us fly $1 billion spacecraft into an asteroid and cheering about it.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, I wonder how many private jets or personal cars would have consumed that amount of fuel.
Yep.
And is it really environmental destruction if you do it in space?
Oh, it's interesting. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it.
I mean, we've just now decided we're going to start target practicing with space junk, right? Thinking of that year 3100 sci-fi film where somebody's flying and they hit and they're like, oh man, they launched this back in 2022. I knew we'd hit it someday.
Yep. Well, we got to start working on that now, right? All right, so I'm going to wrap up. This has been a really good conversation, but we have 3 questions that we ask all of our guests, and so we'll just go through these 1, 2, 3 real quick. What is your favorite dairy-related book or resource?
Oh, I would tell you that if you haven't read Van Soest's fiber book, that's the book. I was it's Fiber Week in our undergrad class, and I told them, I said, you can buy this book, you can resell this book, and it will hold its value. And it's a good read. And he says some crazy things in there, right? But I don't care what animal you're feeding. If you're feeding an animal and it relates to fiber, you will learn something important in there. And fiber is the only reason we're in this, right? So otherwise, we should just be feeding pigs and chickens and fish.
And that is Nutritional Ecology of the Ruminant.
That's the one. I've got 2 copies. I've got an orange one and was it orange? I don't know. I inherited a copy and I still kept it.
I just have the orange one. It's my second copy. I loaned my other one out and it never got returned.
Mistakes were made. That's how I have 3 sheep in RCs. Do I need 3? No, but it's like a revolving door.
You always need a spare NRC.
I gave one we had a really good master's student. He graduated and he read half of it. So I told him if he'd read that much of it, he could keep it. So I'm down to 2.
Well, so that brings to the second question, I guess. What is your favorite book or resource outside of agriculture?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit more challenging, especially because you said outside of agriculture, right?
Yeah, I think when I told you that when we were talking at the beginning, I think I said outside of dairy.
Outside of dairy. I read some really good ethics books, and I would tell you that those probably fall within agriculture, but if you have the time to read those, there's value in trying to appreciate the other point of view and understand really what the animal rights and the animal well-being movements, they are different, and what they are really after in the end. Because I don't think you can really come to terms with a solution unless you understand viewpoints, which actually leads to a really good book that I've only read parts of that I need to read the rest of. But I'm kind of high on it, and we use it in class now every year. But Crucial Confrontations.
Crucial Confrontations or Crucial Conversations?
I went straight to the confrontation.
Oh, I'm reading Crucial Conversations. I didn't read Crucial Confrontations.
Read the other one next.
You gotta read, if you like books about confrontation, you should read High Conflict. I just finished reading that one this summer. That was very good.
Why? I have a notoriously confrontational personality, right?
Yes.
Very argumentative, and I will generally argue anything just for the sake of arguing it.
Yep.
I think there's at least one video of YouTube on a PETA confrontation.
Yep.
And, maybe I'm not very predictable in my approach, but the key for me with those books was how to have an effective confrontation and really reflect on what is it that you're after, and how everything's going to involve compromise. And so, okay, the confrontation part comes very easily for me, but making it effective in resolving what frustrates me has always been a little bit more nebulous. So I tried to pass that along to my students too, to try to, we do all this group project work, and you're going to have that when you go out in jobs, and you're going to get in frustrating situations with people. So how do you more effectively approach that confrontation to reach some sort of, most of the time there's a resolution. Sometimes you're irreconcilable, right? But that's
well, you should read High Conflict. I know you don't have a ton of time for reading, but it was really good. It was very well done.
So I don't know if you remember when I took that test at MSU, they asked you what were the last 3 books you read.
Oh.
And do you remember taking that ADS test, and they asked at the end of the thing, like, what were the last 3 books you read? And
I don't remember that.
Yeah, so I wrote The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, and Jekyll and Hyde. And I was reflecting recently that I've kind of reached the same level of obscure reading history, I think, that I had in high school, probably, because then, of course, the interviews for MSU were based on what you wrote in there. So that really sucked. Right. But recently I read Teddy Roosevelt's History of the Naval War of 1812. And if there's anything that is both enthralling and able to completely squash your desire to read, it's probably Roosevelt writing naval history.
Sounds exactly like the sort of thing you would read, and exactly like the sort of thing I would never even consider reading.
There was moments where it was really good, and it gives you a real appreciation for the birth of a nation, right? Because we focus on the revolution, but the War of 1812, we were pretty much always the losers.
Right. I learned a lot more about the War of 1812 when I moved to Canada.
Yeah.
Just living in Canada, I learned more about it than I ever did in history class.
Yeah, we don't talk a lot about it. And we have, really idolized the USS Constitution, but apart from a few good days, she wasn't doing much either.
There's some ups and downs. Yeah.
But he's a really enlightening writer on the trap you can fall into when you try to tell everybody why they're wrong, too, because a good bit of what he's written just over and over again is criticizing previous historians and all of the downfalls to their logic. And that's really exhausting. So maybe that's what it's like to listen to me sometimes.
No comment.
I'm working on it.
We'll go ahead. We'll move into the last question here so that I don't leave Lydia waiting. And, all of the other students that are sitting in that meeting. She's just the one that I texted because I knew she'd get it. But in your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those that are not?
Yeah, I think this relates back to the question asking earlier. So if you're going to approach dairy as these are the fundamental keys to success, they've been this way, this is what I learned, it's in a textbook, or I learned it from my mentor, or if you're not able to look at every person that you work with an open mind, if you're not able to look at every problem with a fresh take, then you're not going to be as successful. I think it's really that simple. Creativity has a big piece to play in it, but I'm not the most creative. I'm actually not a creative person at all. And I think instead, my ability to ask questions really helps offset that. And so that takes a lot of practice, of course. But I think the world is changing, and the successful people are the people who are going to realize that and try to find a way to continue to contribute to what is a really small field, dairy in general. I don't even care if you're dairy nutrition or just anything dairy. It's a small world. And you need to leverage everybody you know in that small world, and you also need to be willing to work with your favorite and least favorite people in that small world, and be really open-minded about it.
Well, yeah, I don't think you're the first guest that said that, but curiosity is how it's been summed up. Just asking. Yep.
Yeah, that's good. Just also be curious and don't be a hater.
That's words to live by. Gonna cross stitch that on a throw pillow.
Yeah. I'll send it to you for Christmas.
All right. All right. Well, thank you for this conversation today. This was really, we hit on a bunch of different things, but I had a good time. So I hope our listeners do as well. But with that, is there any place where people can find your work or follow you on social or follow up with anything that you're doing?
Well, I'm old, so I still use Twitter at Benjamin, right? BYNJAMMIN. But you said you don't hang out on there anymore. But some
No,
of
I
us
never
still
got
do.
into Twitter. I just never it never clicked with me.
I still adhere to the short messaging too, so I don't write you a book on there. If it's worth saying, it's worth saying short, and it's not worth saying if somebody else already said it. If you are really into some mild entertainment, we have a sheep Facebook page where we're running The Bachelor, right? Pun intended.
The Bachelor.
Yeah, there you go. But that's more the hobby side back at home. And otherwise, probably easiest to find me on LinkedIn or my email address. So,
Well, thank you
or you can look me up on Google Scholar and read that paper nobody reads.
There you go, and make sure you cite it. Get those cited. Do your part to promote the protozoal work. All right. Well, thanks, Benjamin. This was a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
See you later.